She was the one officer willing to walk into the forest after dark, carrying a badge heavy with responsibility and a heart scarred by things the town never asked about. Winter had taught her that silence could be louder than screams, and tonight the silence felt wrong. He was a veteran who had walked away from the world, living where roads ended and memories refused to fade. War had taken his daughter, his sleep, and his faith in second chances, until the only thing that stayed with him was a German shepherd who never stopped believing in the trail ahead. When an 8-year-old girl vanished near the frozen woods, the snow erased her footprints almost as quickly as hope. One followed duty, one followed pain, and one followed a scent so fragile it could disappear with the next gust of wind. As night deepened and the storm closed in, they realized time wasn't their enemy. Cold was, and if they waited for help, the forest would decide the ending for them. Before we begin, please like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Your support truly means everything to us. Snow drifted down over Silver Creek in slow, deliberate sheets, the kind that softened sound and swallowed color, turning the mountain town into a fading sketch beneath a gray winter sky. Officer Claire Mitchell had learned to read winter the way others read faces. At 34, she stood just under 5'9", lean and strong from years of patrol work, her posture straight even when exhaustion tugged at her shoulders. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail beneath her knit patrol cap, a habit born not of vanity but discipline. Her face was angular, cheekbones sharp, jaw firm, with pale skin that winter always left faintly flushed. Claire's eyes were a cool steel blue, observant and guarded, the eyes of someone who listened more than she spoke. People in Silver Creek said she was calm, reliable, a woman who never panicked. What they didn't know was how carefully that calm had been constructed, layered over memories she preferred not to revisit. The radio crackled just as she eased her cruiser to a stop near the edge of town. The dispatcher's voice cut through the hush, strained and urgent. "Claire, we've got a missing child report. 8-year-old female, name's Emma Collins, last seen after school. Parents found her backpack near the North Ridge trailhead." Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel. 8 years old. The words settled heavily in her chest. She acknowledged the call and turned the cruiser toward the forest road, tires crunching over snow that had begun to thicken as the afternoon light dimmed. Winter was closing its fist early today. Emma Collins lived 3 blocks from the elementary school, in a modest, single-story house with peeling blue paint and a porch light that never quite worked right. Claire knew the family in passing. Mark Collins, the father, worked maintenance for the county roads. Broad-shouldered, quiet, hands always rough with grease and salt. Sarah Collins was smaller, slender almost to fragility, with soft brown hair she usually tied back hurriedly and skin pale from long winters and longer worries. She worked part-time at the town library and had a habit of apologizing even when she wasn't at fault. Emma was their only child, bright, curious, the kind of little girl who asked too many questions and trusted the world too easily. When Claire arrived at the trailhead, snow was falling harder now, fat flakes blurring the trees into pale silhouettes. Mark Collins stood near the parked pickup, his thick jacket unzipped despite the cold, breath coming out in sharp bursts. His face was flushed, jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Sarah hovered just behind him, wrapped in a wool coat that seemed too big for her, arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. Her eyes were red, lashes clumped with tears she hadn't managed to stop. She was supposed to come straight home, Sarah said when Claire approached, her voice thin and trembling. She always does. She knows the rules. I only let her walk because it was still light. Claire crouched beside the backpack lying half buried in snow near the tree line. It was pink, patterned with faded cartoon stars, one strap torn. She felt the familiar tightening in her stomach, the quiet alarm that never rang loudly, but never lied either. Did Emma ever go into the woods alone? Claire asked gently, keeping her voice even. Mark shook his head hard. She's scared of the forest, always has been. She won't even play near it unless we're with her. Claire straightened slowly, scanning the ground. Snow was already filling in what little the world might have left behind. Footprints softened into vague depressions, disturbances smoothed over by falling white. She knelt again, gloved fingers brushing across the surface, reading what little remained. A scuffed patch, a broken twig bent too low for an adult to catch accidentally. Something about the spacing felt wrong. She stood and met Sarah's gaze. "When did you last see her?" 3:45, Sarah whispered, glummed. She waved from the sidewalk. She was smiling. The word lingered painfully in the cold air. Claire called in for additional units, but she already knew how long they would take. Silver Creek was small, resources were limited, and winter didn't wait for backup. She made a decision that settled over her like armor. "I'm going to follow what I can before it's gone," she said. "Stay here. I need you both to stay visible." Sarah nodded numbly. Mark looked like he wanted to argue, to charge into the forest himself, but fear anchored him in place. Claire turned toward the trees. The forest at the edge of Silver Creek had a way of changing character as the light faded. In daylight it felt quiet, even welcoming, pine needles soft beneath boots, birds darting between branches. Now, as dusk approached, it grew denser, shadows pooling between trunks, snow clinging to every surface until the world felt muffled and watchful. Claire stepped carefully, breath slow, senses tuned. She had worked this area for nearly 7 years. She knew its moods, and tonight it felt wrong. A few yards in, she found the first thing that made her stop. A glove. Small, purple, lying palm up on the snow as if set there deliberately. Claire picked it up, noting the way the snow beneath was slightly compressed, not dropped gently, removed. Her pulse quickened, but she forced it back down, focusing on the work. Panic helped no one. The light thinned rapidly. Snow began falling sideways now, driven by a rising wind that hissed through the trees. Claire checked her watch. Less than 90 minutes until full dark. She pushed deeper, following faint disturbances that only someone trained to look for absence rather than presence would notice. The forest seemed to close around her. Then she saw the cabin. It sat farther in than she remembered, a low structure of darkened logs half buried in snow, smoke curling faintly from a crooked chimney. The sight gave her pause. No one officially lived this far out anymore. She approached cautiously, hand resting near her sidearm, senses sharpened. The door opened before she knocked. The man who stepped out was tall, easily over 6 feet, his frame broad but not bulky, the build of someone who had once been powerful and had learned to conserve strength. He looked to be in his early 40s, dark hair cropped short and flecked with gray at the temples. A rough beard shadowed a face marked by sharp lines and a narrow scar cutting through one eyebrow. His eyes were dark, deep-set, and alert, carrying the quiet intensity of someone who had seen things most people hadn't. He wore a heavy jacket patched at the elbows and boots, worn smooth by years of use. Beside him emerged a German shepherd, large and imposing, around 6 years old by Claire's estimation. The dog's coat was thick, black and tan, dusted with snow, muscles visible beneath the fur. His ears stood tall, eyes a striking amber, fixed on Claire with intelligence and restraint. He did not bark. He did not move. He simply watched. "I didn't hear a vehicle," the man said calmly. His voice was low, measured, edged with caution rather than hostility. "Officer Claire Mitchell," she replied, keeping her hands visible. "Silver Creek Police, we have a missing child." The man's expression changed subtly, something tightening behind his eyes. "Name's Ethan Walker," he said after a pause. "This is Bear." At the sound of his name, the dog shifted slightly, tail still, posture attentive. Claire explained quickly, showing the glove and describing Emma. Ethan listened without interrupting, gaze flicking briefly toward the forest, as if calculating distances and directions. When Claire finished, she extended the glove. "Have you seen anything?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he nodded once toward Bear. The dog stepped forward, lowered his head, and sniffed the glove. The transformation was immediate. Bear's body tensed, ears angling forward, nostrils flaring as he took in the scent. He lifted his head and looked into the trees, a low sound rumbling deep in his chest. Not a growl of aggression, but recognition. Ethan exhaled slowly. "She passed through here," he said, "recently." Claire felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "You're sure?" Bear took a few steps toward the forest, stopped and looked back at Ethan, waiting. Ethan met Claire's eyes. "He doesn't forget fear," he said quietly, and that sense scared. Claire hesitated only a second. Protocol warred with instinct, but winter was merciless and time was thinning fast. "Then we're not waiting," she said. Ethan reached for his coat, pulling it on with practiced efficiency. "I wasn't planning to," he replied. The snow thickened, swallowing the last pale light of day as the three of them, officer, veteran, and dog, turned toward the forest. Somewhere ahead, a little girl waited, and the night was closing in. The forest swallowed sound first, then light, as Claire Mitchell stepped beyond the last visible edge of Silver Creek. Dusk folded itself into night with unsettling speed, the snow thickening until each flake seemed to erase the world behind it. Her breath fogged the air in steady bursts, controlled, deliberate, the way she had trained herself to breathe when fear threatened to sharpen into panic. The radio at her shoulder crackled faintly, already struggling against distance and terrain, but she ignored it for now. The ground beneath her boots told a more urgent story. The trail was no longer obvious, not in the way people imagined trails to be. There were no clean footprints, no clear line of travel. Instead, there were absences. Snow compressed more deeply in places where weight had lingered. A narrow drag line cut unevenly through the white, shallow but unmistakable, as if something light had been pulled for a short distance before being lifted again. Claire crouched, gloved fingers hovering just above the surface, her eyes tracing patterns most would overlook. A broken pine branch hung at knee-height, snapped not by wind, but by sudden force. A few feet beyond it, another sign, a child's knit glove, purple once, now gray with slush, crushed beneath a heavy tread. Her stomach tightened. Emma Collins had not wandered. She had been interrupted. The temperature dropped fast, the kind of cold that seeped through layers and into bone. Wind cut sideways through the trees, driving snow at an angle that stung exposed skin and erased the past with ruthless efficiency. Claire checked her watch. Less than an hour since the call, and already the forest was reclaiming its secrets. She knew the rule as well as anyone. When tracks disappear, people disappear with them. She moved forward anyway. The forest grew denser as she climbed, pines crowding close together, their branches sagging under fresh snow. Visibility shrank to a few yards at best. Claire's hand hovered near her sidearm, not from expectation of violence, but from instinct. The same instinct that had kept her alive during years of solitary patrols. She had always volunteered for the outer zones, the places other officers avoided. Some said she trusted the woods more than people. They weren't entirely wrong. That was when she noticed the structure. At first it looked like a shadow that didn't belong, a dark shape interrupting the uniform white. As she drew closer, the lines sharpened into a cabin, old and low, built of weathered logs, darkened by decades of snow and sun. It sat just off what might once have been a hunting path, now nearly erased. Smoke drifted thinly from a crooked chimney, barely visible against the gray sky. Claire slowed, senses tightening. No one officially lived this deep anymore. She approached with care, boots placed deliberately, posture calm but ready. Before she reached the door, it opened. Ethan Walker stepped out as if he had been expecting someone, though his eyes flicked briefly to the trees before settling on her. Up close, Claire could see the quiet damage written into him. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, though the strength there felt contained, controlled. His face was angular, nose slightly crooked as if broken long ago, a narrow scar cutting through one eyebrow. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw, and faint lines bracketed his mouth, not from age so much as restraint. His eyes were dark brown, steady, alert, the eyes of a man who slept lightly and listened constantly. There was a stillness to him that felt practiced. Beside him moved Bear. The German shepherd was large, solid, every inch of him purposeful. His black and tan coat was thick enough to shrug off the cold, dusted now, with snowflakes that clung and melted along his back. His ears stood tall, perfectly aligned, and his amber eyes locked onto Claire with focused intelligence. He didn't bark. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply watched, muscles coiled, tail still. A working dog, trained, disciplined. "I didn't hear a car," Ethan said quietly. His voice was low, roughened slightly, but calm, not unfriendly, not welcoming either. "Officer Claire Mitchell," she replied, keeping her hands visible, her tone even. "Silver Creek Police, we have a missing child." That did something to him. It was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a shift in weight that transferred pressure off his left leg, revealing a faint limp he hadn't bothered to hide. Ethan nodded once, then glanced down at Bear, as if including him in the conversation. "Name's Ethan Walker," he said. "This is Bear." At the sound of his name, Bear flicked his ears and stepped half a pace forward, then stopped, waiting. Claire explained quickly. 8-year-old girl, backpack found near the trailhead, purple glove recovered deeper in. She held the glove out as she spoke. Ethan listened without interrupting, gaze fixed not on her face, but on the tree line beyond her shoulder, as if mapping distances, calculating possibilities. When she finished, he reached out and took the glove, then knelt. "Bear?" he said softly. The dog lowered his head and inhaled deeply, nostrils flaring. His entire body changed in an instant, muscles tightened, ears angled forward. His breathing slowed, focused. A low sound vibrated in his chest, not aggressive but alert, resonant with recognition. Bear lifted his head and stared into the forest, then looked back at Ethan, waiting. She passed through here, Ethan said after a moment. His voice had dropped even lower. Recently. Claire felt the words settle like ice. You're sure? Ethan met her eyes. He doesn't confuse fear, he said. That sense scared, and she wasn't alone. Bear stepped toward the trees, then stopped again, checking in, disciplined enough not to move without permission. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath of someone making a decision he had already made once before in another life. Claire hesitated only briefly. Procedure demanded backup, coordination, daylight. Reality demanded speed. We don't have time to wait, she said. Ethan pulled on his coat, movements efficient, practiced. I know. They moved together into the forest, Bear leading, nose low, body cutting through snow with effortless focus. The deeper they went, the more signs emerged, not obvious but undeniable to those who knew how to read them. A second drag mark, slightly deeper this time. A place where the snow had been disturbed unevenly, suggesting a stumble. The faint imprint of a larger boot, tread heavier than a child's, pressed down with purpose. Claire's thoughts churned as she followed. She thought of Sarah Collins, thin shoulders hunched beneath that oversized coat, hands shaking as she tried to hold herself together. She imagined Mark standing rigid at the trailhead, helpless anger coiled tight in his chest. And she thought of Emma, small, brave, confused, being pulled deeper into a world that did not care how young she was. The wind picked up again, howling through the pines, carrying the promise of worse weather. Snow began to fall harder, thicker, obscuring everything but the narrow slice of ground ahead. Darkness closed in fully now, the forest illuminated only by Claire's flashlight and the pale reflection of snow. At one point, Bear stopped abruptly. He sniffed the air, then turned his head sharply to the right. Ethan followed his gaze and stiffened. They changed direction, he said. Claire scanned the area. Why would they do that? Ethan's jaw tightened. To lose anyone following, or because something went wrong. They pressed on, the terrain growing steeper, more uneven. Claire noticed Ethan favoring his left leg more as the ground worsened, though he never slowed, never complained. There was a discipline to him that reminded her uncomfortably of soldiers she had known, men who pushed through pain because stopping meant thinking. After another 20 minutes, Bear led them to a small clearing barely visible through the trees. There, half buried in snow, lay a scrap of pink fabric caught on a low branch. Claire recognized it immediately. Backpack lining. She was here, Claire whispered. Bear sniffed the fabric, then whined softly, a sound of frustration before moving again. The trail continued, but weaker now, stretched thin by wind and time. Claire checked her watch again. Night had fully claimed the forest. The temperature continued to fall. Somewhere ahead, Emma Collins was still alive, but winter was patient. It could wait them out. They moved on, not knowing how close or how far they were, only that turning back was no longer an option. Night closed fully over the forest, swift and absolute. The last traces of dusk vanished behind layers of cloud, leaving the woods wrapped in darkness, broken only by the pale cone of Claire Mitchell's flashlight and the muted reflection of snow. The temperature dropped another few degrees, cold seeping through fabric and skin until even breath felt sharp in the lungs. Somewhere above them, wind shook the treetops, sending cascades of snow whispering down like restless spirits. Claire adjusted her grip on the light, her jaw set, her movements measured. She and Ethan Walker had exchanged no words when the darkness finally claimed the forest. None were needed. Turning back was no longer an option. Bear moved ahead of them with unwavering focus. The German shepherd's large frame cut a steady path through the snow, his thick black and tan coat bristling against the wind, amber eyes fixed on what lay ahead rather than what closed in behind. His nose hovered just above the ground, tracing a scent thread so faint it seemed impossible that it still existed. Yet Bear followed it with the quiet confidence of a dog who had once worked in environments where hesitation cost lives. His paws made almost no sound, each step deliberate, controlled. Claire stayed close, matching his pace, her tall, lean figure blending into the shadows between the trees. Her steel blue eyes scanned constantly, not just the path but the periphery, the places where danger preferred to wait. She had been trained to expect threats from people, but tonight the forest itself felt like an adversary. Snow erased distance. Darkness swallowed depth. It was easy to misjudge a slope, a drop, a turn that led nowhere. Still, Claire trusted her instincts, the same instincts that had kept her alive through years of solitary patrols and taught her when to push forward despite the fear pressing at her ribs. Ethan followed just behind her, his broad shoulders hunched slightly against the cold. At 41, he still carried the physical imprint of his years in uniform. Solid build, restrained strength. But there was a stiffness to his movements now, especially when the terrain sloped unevenly. His left leg lagged subtly, a reminder of an injury he rarely spoke about. A faint limp emerged when he thought no one was watching, though he never slowed, never asked for a pause. His face, half shadowed by stubble and falling snow, was carved with tension held too long, the kind that etched itself deep rather than fading with time. The trail Bear followed told a grim story. At first it was subtle. Compressed snow where weight had shifted awkwardly, drag marks shallow but repeated. Then it grew clearer. There were stretches where the scent indicated Emma Collins had been carried, lifted off the ground entirely. Claire's chest tightened each time Bear paused and sniffed the air higher, following a trail that no longer touched the snow. A child that small could not have walked far in these conditions, without leaving clear prints. Someone had carried her to save time or to silence her. After nearly 40 minutes of steady movement, Bear slowed, circling once before stopping near a cluster of young pines. He lowered his head, sniffed, then stepped back, ears twitching. Claire moved closer and saw it. A patch of ground where the snow had been disturbed in a rough circle. Nearby lay a torn scrap of blue plastic, brittle with cold. "A tarp," Ethan said quietly, kneeling with care. He brushed snow aside, revealing impressions beneath. Boot prints, uneven and smaller scuffs beside them. They stopped here. Claire scanned the area, light sweeping over the trees. "Rest point," she murmured. "Or regroup." Bear nosed toward a length of coarse rope half buried under snow. Then another object, a small wheel track, narrow, shallow. Not a full vehicle, not here. A handcart, maybe. Something improvised. "They're moving slow," Claire said. "Either injured, inexperienced, or both." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Which makes them unpredictable." They took shelter briefly behind the trees, using the break to drink water and adjust layers. The wind had picked up again, biting harder now, pushing snow sideways in stinging sheets. Claire flexed her fingers, fighting stiffness. She glanced at Ethan and caught the way his gaze lingered on the disturbed snow, distant, unfocused, as if seeing something else entirely. "My daughter was 8. he said suddenly. Claire looked at him, surprised by the abruptness. He hadn't looked up. His voice was steady, but there was an edge beneath it, something brittle. "Same age," he continued, "same stubborn streak, same way of trusting the world even when it didn't deserve it." He paused, breath fogging the air. "She died in a highway accident 6 years ago. Drunk driver, I wasn't there." Claire said nothing. She knew better than to fill that space with words. "I came back from overseas thinking I'd already lost everything that mattered," Ethan went on. "Turns out I was wrong. Losing her that finished the job." He glanced briefly at Bear, who stood alert, watching the forest even as his ears flicked toward Ethan's voice. "He's the only reason I didn't disappear completely." Bear shifted closer, brushing Ethan's knee with his shoulder, grounding him in the present. Claire swallowed. "You didn't have to come," she said quietly. Ethan met her eyes at last. "Neither did you." They didn't speak again after that. Bear moved forward first, pulling them back into motion. The terrain grew rougher, the forest thinning in places, where rocky outcrops broke through the snow. The scent trail weakened further, stretched thin by wind and time, but Bear adjusted, zigzagging when needed, lifting his head to catch what the ground could no longer hold. Claire's flashlight beam caught flashes of reflective frost on stone, the occasional animal track crossing and fading. Every unfamiliar sound made her muscles tense. Then Bear stopped abruptly, his body rigid, tail low, ears angled forward. A soft whine escaped him, not fear, but urgency. Claire stepped beside him and saw what he was seeing. Ahead, partially hidden by snow-laden brush, was a makeshift shelter, a torn tarp strung low between two trees, sagging under the weight of snow. Beneath it lay a bundle of blankets, dirty and unevenly arranged. "They were here recently," Claire whispered. She approached slowly, checking the area. The blankets were cold now, but not frozen stiff. Nearby, a child's boot print appeared, shallow and erratic, toes turned inward with fatigue. Claire crouched, heart pounding. Emma had walked here on her own. Bear sniffed the blankets, then lifted his head sharply, looking downhill. He let out a short, sharp bark, controlled, precise. Ethan followed his line of sight. They moved again. Claire checked her watch. Past midnight, the temperature was still falling. Hypothermia was no longer a distant threat. It was imminent. "We're close," Claire said, though she didn't know whether she was reassuring Ethan or herself. They descended carefully, the slope slick beneath fresh snow. Ethan's limp became more pronounced here, but he pushed through it, teeth clenched, breath controlled. Bear moved ahead, pausing often now, recalibrating, correcting. The scent was thin but persistent. At the bottom of the slope, Bear slowed once more. His head lifted, nostrils flaring as he scented the air rather than the ground. His posture shifted, tense, alert, focused forward. Claire felt it too then, not a sound, not a movement, just a change. The forest seemed to hold its breath. "There's someone ahead," Ethan said quietly. Claire nodded, switching off her flashlight. Darkness rushed in, thick and disorienting, but her eyes adjusted enough to make out shapes. They moved carefully, silently, closing distance inch by inch. A faint sound carried through the trees. Not wind, not animal. A sob. Claire's heart slammed hard against her ribs. She dropped to a knee, scanning desperately. "There," Ethan whispered. They didn't rush. They couldn't. Bear moved first, silent as snow itself, leading them toward the sound. Somewhere ahead, a frightened child was alive in the dark, and the night had not yet won. Near midnight, the forest changed again. The wind thinned, not calmer but sharper, slicing through the trees with a sound like breath drawn through clenched teeth. Snow continued to fall, slower now, heavier, each flake landing with quiet finality. Bear stopped so suddenly that Claire nearly collided with him. His body went rigid, head low, ears angled forward, every muscle locked into purpose. From somewhere ahead, barely audible beneath the hush of snowfall, came a sound so small it might have been imagined, a child's sob, broken, exhausted, real. Claire dropped to a knee, heart pounding so hard she felt it in her throat. She turned off her flashlight, letting darkness reclaim the space, trusting her eyes to adjust. Ethan crouched beside her, his large frame moving with surprising silence despite the uneven ground. He followed Bear's line of sight and saw it too, the outline of a structure emerging from the trees, low and rectangular, its roof sagging beneath years of snow and neglect. An old lumber storage shed, abandoned when logging routes shifted decades ago. Its walls were warped planks nailed together without care, gaps between boards stuffed with snow and shadow. One corner leaned inward, as if the building itself were tired of standing. The crying came again, weaker this time. "That's her," Claire whispered, though there was no doubt left to confirm. They approached slowly, using the trees for cover. Bear moved first, soundless despite his size, placing each paw with deliberate care. Claire followed, her tall, lean frame blending into the darkness, her breathing measured. Ethan stayed close, favoring his injured leg but refusing to lag behind. The closer they drew, the more Claire noticed details that made her skin crawl. A single set of adult boot prints circled the shed erratically, a dragged line in the snow leading to the door, no vehicle tracks nearby. Whoever had brought Emma here hadn't planned well or far. Claire raised a hand, signaling stop. She listened. Inside the shed, a man's voice muttered under his breath, sharp with panic, words tumbling over each other too fast to form sentences. The sound of something being knocked over followed, then silence, then the sobbing again. "He's alone," Ethan murmured, "and losing control." Claire nodded. She had dealt with men like this before, not hardened criminals, not organized predators, but desperate, unstable individuals who made terrible choices when fear and failure boxed them in. That didn't make them less dangerous, it made them more unpredictable. They split without discussion. Ethan moved left, keeping low, using the shadow of the leaning wall. Claire circled right, her movements precise, her hand resting near her weapon. Bear stayed centered, eyes fixed on the door, muscles coiled. The door to the shed hung crooked on its hinges, barely closed. Light leaked through a gap near the bottom, dim, yellow, trembling. A lantern. Claire counted silently. 3 breaths. 4. Then Bear moved. He burst forward in a blur of motion and power, slamming into the door with his shoulder. The rotten wood splintered instantly, the door flying inward with a crack that shattered the night's stillness. The man inside shouted in shock, scrambling backward, knocking over the lantern, which swung wildly, casting frantic shadows across the walls. Claire surged in behind Bear, weapon raised, voice sharp and commanding. "Police, don't move!" The man spun, wild-eyed, his face gaunt beneath a scruffy beard that hadn't been trimmed in months. He was in his late 30s, thin to the point of brittleness, with sharp cheekbones and a nose reddened by cold and stress. His clothes were mismatched and worn, layers thrown together without care. His hands shook violently as he raised them halfway, then dropped them again, caught between surrender and flight. His eyes darted everywhere at once, refusing to settle. In the far corner of the shed, huddled against the wall, was Emma Collins. She was small, curled into herself, wrapped in an oversized jacket that swallowed her frame. Her dark hair was tangled and damp with melted snow, plastered to her pale forehead. Her lips were tinged blue, her cheeks blotchy with cold and tears. Rope lay loose around her wrists, knotted poorly, the fibers rough and red against her skin. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, tracking Bear as if he were the only solid thing left in the world. Ethan moved in an instant, intercepting the man as he lurched toward the back wall. There was no dramatic struggle, no prolonged fight. The man slipped on the snow-covered floorboards, panic robbing him of coordination. Bear lunged at the same moment, jaws closing around the man's sleeve, dragging him down with controlled force. The dog didn't bite flesh. He pinned, trained, precise. "Stay down," Claire ordered, stepping forward, adrenaline surging. She moved quickly, cuffing the man while Bear held him in place. Amber eyes locked, teeth bared inches from the man's arm. The man collapsed into sobs the moment the cuffs clicked, his resistance dissolving into incoherent apologies and curses. Claire barely heard him. She was already kneeling in front of Emma. "It's okay," she said softly, lowering her weapon and her voice together. "You're safe now. My name is Claire." Emma didn't respond. She stared at Bear, her small body trembling violently, breaths shallow and rapid. Claire noticed the signs immediately, hypothermia setting in. She slipped off her own jacket without hesitation and wrapped it around the girl, rubbing her arms gently to encourage circulation. Ethan shrugged out of his coat and draped it over Emma as well, layering warmth carefully, efficiently. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice rough but steady. "You did good. You're strong. It's over now." At the sound of his voice, Emma shifted slightly. Then, slowly, she reached out and wrapped her arms around Bear's thick neck, burying her face into his fur. The sob that tore from her was raw and unrestrained, the sound of fear finally releasing its grip. Bear froze, then settled carefully, lowering himself so she could lean fully against him. He didn't move, didn't protest, simply allowed her to cling, his body radiating heat and calm. Claire swallowed hard, her eyes burning. They worked quickly after that. Claire radioed for backup and medical support, her voice clipped but steady. Ethan kept Bear still while Emma's shivering gradually slowed, though her grip on the dog never loosened. The man in cuffs, his name would come later, sat slumped against the wall, head in his hands, muttering about money, about mistakes, about things spiraling too fast. Claire ignored him. He would survive the night. That was enough for now. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but the wind had eased. The sky, once pitch black, had begun to lighten imperceptibly, the faintest wash of gray bleeding into the horizon. Dawn was still distant, but it was coming. When the rescue team finally arrived, lights cutting through the trees, Emma was carried carefully on a stretcher, wrapped in blankets and coats. Even then, she reached for Bear, her fingers tightening in his fur, until Ethan gently pried them free, promising quietly that Bear was coming too. As they moved Emma towards safety, Claire looked back once at the shed, now illuminated and small, its menace stripped away by light and presence. The edge of survival had been crossed. Barely. Behind them, Bear shook the snow from his coat and stood tall again, watchful, his work not yet finished, but his purpose fulfilled for this night. And above the trees, the sky continued to pale, as if the world itself was exhaling after holding its breath. Morning arrived quietly, as if it feared disturbing what the night had nearly taken. Pale light seeped through the clouds over Silver Creek, turning the snow from steel gray to a soft, almost forgiving white. The storm had loosened its grip, leaving behind a town suspended in exhausted silence. Tire tracks and boot prints scarred the streets, evidence of a night when sleep had abandoned everyone at once. The rescue vehicle rolled into town just after sunrise. Its lights were still flashing, though no siren sounded now. There was no need. Word had already spread. People stood on porches wrapped in coats and blankets, faces drawn and pale, watching as the stretcher was carried carefully toward the clinic at the edge of Main Street. Emma Collins lay bundled beneath layers of thermal blankets, her small frame almost disappearing beneath them. Her cheeks were still pale, lips dry and cracked, but her breathing was steady now, shallow yet regular. One mittened hand clutched a corner of the blanket as if afraid it might be taken away. Her eyes fluttered open briefly when the cold air shifted, and for a moment panic flickered across her face, until she saw Bear walking beside the stretcher. The German shepherd moved with uncharacteristic slowness, every step deliberate, his thick black and tan coat dusted with frost that sparkled faintly in the growing light. His amber eyes never left Emma. Even bandaged hands reached for him when the medics adjusted her blankets, and Bear responded by lowering his head, pressing close enough that she could feel his warmth. Only then did the tension ease from her small shoulders. Sarah Collins was waiting at the clinic doors when they arrived. She looked smaller than Claire remembered, her slender frame swallowed by a long wool coat cinched too tightly at the waist. Her brown hair hung loose around her face, strands escaping from a hurried knot, and her pale skin was blotched red from crying and cold. She didn't seem to breathe until she saw Emma's face. Then the sound that left her chest was half sob, half prayer. "Oh, my baby," she whispered, rushing forward before anyone could stop her. Her hands shook violently as she touched Emma's cheek, as if afraid her daughter might vanish again at the slightest pressure. Mark Collins stood just behind her, taller and broader, his heavy work jacket still streaked with road salt and grease. His jaw trembled despite his effort to hold it firm, and when Emma's eyes opened and found him, his composure broke completely. He pressed his forehead to hers, his voice cracking as he repeated her name again and again, grounding himself in its sound. Claire Mitchell watched from a few steps back, her tall figure still, shoulders squared as always. Snow clung to her boots and the hem of her uniform, but she barely noticed. Her steel blue eyes softened as she took in the reunion, the raw, unfiltered relief pouring out of the Collins family. She had seen reunions before, some joyful, some incomplete. This one struck deeper, perhaps because it had almost not happened at all. Ethan Walker stood farther away, near the edge of the parking lot where the snow remained untouched. He kept his hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched slightly, his breath slow and controlled. In the growing daylight, his face looked older than it had in the dark forest. Lines etched deeply around his eyes and mouth. The scar through his eyebrow stood out more clearly now, pale against weathered skin. He watched Emma smile weakly at her parents, watched the color slowly return to her face, and something loosened inside his chest that he hadn't realized was still locked tight. When the clinic doors closed behind the family, Ethan turned as if to leave without a word. Claire noticed and approached him, her boots crunching softly on the snow. "They're going to want to thank you," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact. Ethan shook his head once. "They don't owe me anything." Claire studied him for a moment. Up close in daylight, she could see the faint tremor in his hands, the way exhaustion clung to him now that adrenaline had faded. "You saved a child," she said quietly. "That matters." He met her gaze, dark eyes steady. "So did you." Claire didn't argue. She knew the truth sat somewhere between them. "The town will ask questions," she added. "About last night." "They can ask," Ethan replied. "I don't need answers from them." Bear lay down in the snow nearby, curling his body into a tight, efficient shape. His breathing was slow, deep, the rhythm of a dog who had worked hard and finished well. For the first time since Claire had met him, his eyes closed fully. Later that morning, Silver Creek gathered in small clusters along Main Street. News traveled fast in a town this size, faster than official reports ever could. Some people spoke in hushed voices, others openly, relief and shock mixing freely. There was talk of bravery, of miracles, of how close everything had come to ending differently. At the clinic, Emma slept beneath warm blankets while a nurse with kind eyes and steady hands checked her vitals. Sarah never left her side, brushing her daughter's hair gently, whispering stories from when Emma was smaller, anchoring her back to a world that felt safe again. Mark stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed tightly, watching every rise and fall of Emma's chest, as if committing the sight to memory. When Emma woke again, stronger this time, the first word she spoke was not Mom or Dad. "Bear?" The nurse smiled and nodded toward the door. Moments later, Bear was led in, moving slowly, respectfully, as if he understood the sacredness of the space. Emma reached out, her small fingers sinking into his thick fur, and laughed, a quiet, fragile sound, but unmistakably real. Outside, Ethan listened to that laugh through the open window. His throat tightened and he turned away, before anyone could see the moisture in his eyes. Claire found him later near his truck, a battered old vehicle dusted with snow. She handed him a cup of coffee, steam curling into the cold air. "You're not staying," she said. Ethan took the cup, warming his hands. "No," Claire nodded. "Silver Creek will remember this." He allowed himself a faint, humorless smile. "Towns remember what they want. I'm fine with being forgotten." They stood in silence for a while, watching the town come back to life, inch by inch. Snowplows passed, doors opened, children's voices returned cautiously to the streets. Before leaving, Ethan knelt beside Bear, resting his forehead briefly against the dog's. "Good work," he murmured. Bear opened one eye, tail giving a single lazy thump against the snow. As Ethan drove away, Claire watched until the truck disappeared beyond the curve of the road, leading back toward the forest. She understood something then with quiet certainty. There were people who moved through the world unnoticed, carrying weight no one else could see. They didn't seek recognition or redemption. They simply answered when darkness called. Bear remained behind for a moment longer, standing beside Claire as the sun climbed higher. Then he followed Ethan without looking back. Silver Creek would heal. Emma would heal. Life would return to its routines and assumptions. But for those who had stood on the edge that night, something had shifted. In the coldest hours, when the storm was at its worst, hope had arrived not as thunder or light, but as a broken man who chose to walk back into the dark, and a loyal dog who never lost the scent of what mattered. And sometimes, Claire thought as she turned toward her station, that was enough. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder, fire, or sudden light tearing open the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, wrapped in falling snow, carried by tired hands, and guided by a heart that refuses to turn away. That night in the forest was not just a rescue. It was a reminder. a reminder that God often works through ordinary people who choose courage when fear would be easier, through a broken veteran who stepped back into the darkness instead of running from it, through a loyal dog who followed a fragile scent when hope was nearly erased, through a police officer who listened not only to protocol, but to the quiet voice pressing her forward. In our own lives, storms come without warning. Loss, fear, loneliness, moments when the path disappears beneath us and night feels endless. Yet again and again, God sends help, not always in the form we expect, but always in the moment we need it most. A stranger who shows up, a hand that reaches out, a presence that says you are not alone. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you of this truth. No darkness is too deep for God's light to find you. No road is too cold for grace to walk beside you, and no cry is ever too small for heaven to hear. If you believe in second chances, quiet miracles, and the power of love and loyalty, please share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together, sharing stories of faith, courage, compassion, and the miracles that still walk among us. May God bless you and your family. May He protect those you love, heal the hearts that are weary, and place His gentle hand over everyone watching right now. Amen.